Greetings from Melbourne, Australia last week. I hope everyone's having a great time at the meeting. Sorry I'm not able to be there, but it's great to have this opportunity to give this talk about how we can take theoretical developments in how we model organisms together with technical developments in how we organize data to improve the utility of functional trait databases. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, who you can see listed below. The second one being one of the organisers of this symposium. And this is a work in progress, but we're getting close to finishing it. So it's exciting at a meeting like this to think about all the different kinds of data we can now link together about biodiversity, all this living data, through persistent identifiers. And in this web of data, one of the most challenging ones, I think, is the trait data. Now, the trait concept is really anything you can observe and measure about an organism. So it's so broad as to almost be as useful as the concept of a thing. But there's been a lot of thought conceptually and technically about what we do with trait data, how do we deal with it? And that includes, what do we include in the first place? For instance, do we include habitat aspects of an organism in a trait database or not? What level should we organize the data, and how do we deal with these different levels of organization, from individuals to populations to species? How do we prioritize trait data? How do we know what trait data we need? Where are the gaps? How do we standardize it, including what metadata do we need? And how do we put it all together and connect and store it? So, as I mentioned, there's been conceptual and technical work on this problem. From a conceptual point of view, a really important step was this paper by Cyril Viol and colleagues in 2007, Let the Concept of Trait Be Functional, which is really emphasizing that we want traits to link to performance of organisms, to growth, reproduction, survival. And more recently, my colleagues and I wrote a paper that is kind of following on from the latter paper, called Where Did Functional Traits Come From? The Role of Theory and Models. And we were looking at this from the perspective of modeling organisms as dynamical systems, using something called dynamical systems modeling, which wasn't familiar to me through my undergraduate and PhD training, but it's a kind of model that's used a lot in physics. And what I'm going to do now is give you a sense of what these kinds of models are and how they tell us what functional traits are, because they demand parameters, and those parameters link to functional traits. So a dynamical systems model, I'm just going to check I'm recording, yes. A dynamical systems model involves state variables, and those state variables evolve through time. So we have a rate of change equation of the state, and examples of state variables might be the body size or the body temperature or the water content. These are not traits, but states. And so these traits evolve through time, and we can crank this model and work out how those things are changing, and from those get things like growth, reproduction, and survival, making them functional in the sense of the Viol paper. But of course, we also need environmental forcings, so things like food, temperature, and humidity, that drive the model through time and make things change. So there's various kinds of things we can model with dynamical systems models. We can model behavior, we can model heat budgets, but the most fundamental thing we can model is the metabolism of the organism, you can think of it as the energy budget, the dynamic energy budget. And there's a theory called dynamic energy budget theory, which is a really powerful way of modeling the organism as a dynamical system from first principles of physics and chemistry, where it treats the organism as a set of macrochemicals that are evolving through time, food being converted into biomass, and the metabolic waste products and heat being produced. And what we get out of this kind of model is the mass of the animal through time. But you can see this is the mass broken up into different state variables. In particular, we have in green the structure, in grey the reserve, in brown the stomach contents, and in pink the reproduction buffer, or the eggs, egg material growing in the organism. So that's what we get out of a dynamical systems model of the metabolism, out of this DEB theory. And to give you a little bit more of an understanding of how it works. And this is going to be superficial because there's not much time, but the first process is food being converted to the reserve. So that's a chemical transformation called assimilation, feces being produced as a result. And this is, you can think of reserve as a metabolic substrate, which is used to do the rest of the metabolism, including things immediately and also things in the future. So it's not reserve for the only things in the future. It's used immediately and in the future. And so there's a constant flow out of that reserve that is going to, a fraction of which is going to growing the organism, when that's the structure. So the structure is what is built through growth, the process of growth. And the structure also needs maintenance. So there's some of the energy that is coming down this path gets used to pay the maintenance, and whatever is left over is then building new structure. And similarly, well, not similarly, but the other fraction of the reserve flowing out is going initially to the process of maturation. So the developmental work to organize the organism is explicit in this model. And then once maturity has been reached, the energy is going into the reproduction buffer, so producing biomass in terms of offspring, although there's always a maintenance cost to keeping the final level of maturity that is reached. So that is, in a nutshell, the Deb theory as a dynamical systems model. And it goes through the whole life cycle. So it starts off as an embryo, and the only difference between an embryo and a hatchling in the Deb theory is this part here, the feeding process, doesn't happen, and it's just starting off as pure reserve. So that's a good way to think about reserve. It's what an egg is made of. It's got everything you need to build, in this case, a baby lizard. So that's an example of a dynamical systems model. And of course, all these models need parameters, and that's what this lambda here is. And it's the parameters that tell us what trait data we need to measure. And in the DEB model, our dynamic energy budget model, these are the parameters. There's essentially one parameter per process, but it has a lot of processes that are being considered in a network. So there's a few parameters. And this is where all those parameters link into the system diagram. But the things that we can use to estimate the DEB parameters, these are the basic parameters we must have on the left. There's some that you don't necessarily need, but these are the ones you definitely need. And this is the minimum set of observations you need to estimate those parameters. And they're things like age at birth, age at maturity, length at birth, wet mass at puberty, reproduction rate, things that are quite commonly measured as trait data. And there's a one-to-many relationship between the parameters and the traits. Because essentially anything that you can churn out from the model as an observation from the model can be used to estimate the parameters, but there's a minimum set that you need, which is these. And you can see that because there's a one-to-many relationship between the different parameters and the observations, that tightly constrains the wriggle room of what parameters can fit these set of observations. So it's a really powerful setup. You can actually estimate the parameters of this rather sophisticated model. And there's a process that's been set up to do this called the Add My Pet project. It's set up in MATLAB. There's a PLOS computational biology paper describing the whole thing. And it's been done for over 6,000 species of animal now. And all that information, all the parameters and all the code can be found on this website, the Add My Pet project. And when you go into there, you go to the species list, you'll see all the species. And skip a slide. So this is the list of the species. And on the right here, all of the observations that were needed, all the functional trait data that was needed to estimate the parameters of the model. But the trait data is sitting inside MATLAB files, so it's not in a database. It's in code, and so you can see this is an example of the my data file for a fish, and you can see it's got age at birth here at 47 days, and the temperature associated with that, the metadata temperature was 4 degrees. So there's a huge amount of information. All the metadata and everything is sitting in there, but it's not very accessible. So what Nat Briscoe and Chris Wild and I have been doing is writing code to pull all that information out of these MATLAB files and putting them into a database and then seeing what we've got, what sort of coverage do we have, and what sort of patterns do we have. And it's a really powerful database because all of the numbers that have gone into it have been used to estimate parameters, which weeds out errors in the observations. And it's very complete in that there's lots of, every species has at least that bare minimum of observations that I showed you before. And when we look in at what we've got in this database, here's some of the numbers. The most common thing we have in the database is the ultimate wet weight, that's WWI, over 4,000 observations. But then there's over 1,600 observations of age at birth or incubation time, each with a temperature. And so we can then play around with that data and see how it looks compared to other databases. Here's a couple of plots of the age at birth corrected to a constant temperature of 20 degrees, and the weight of the hatchling. And in the light blue in both cases are the data in that database, and then the other colors are data in other databases. But then the question arises, how do we organize all of this? And that's where traits.build comes to the rescue. So this is a setup that's relatively recent. This paper that was led by Lizzie Wenck and Dan Folster explains the whole process, and it's built off the Austraits approach, and it's highly standardized in connecting with Darwin Core, the ecological trait data standard, the extensible observation ontology, and FAIR principles. And it has a really nice setup for organizing in a relational sense your trait data and the associated metadata and the taxonomy. So it's actually beautifully receives all of the data that's come out of this estimation process that's sitting in those files. So we're pulling it all out, putting it in a database, but then ultimately, instead of putting the data hardwired into the MATLAB files in the future, we want people to put it into a database, and then we pull from the database to estimate the parameters. But then what's really cool about this is that once you have a dynamic energy budget model of an organism, you can get all sorts of observations out that of essentially estimates of traits that you didn't actually put in. This is a bit like reanalysis weather data, like the NCEP or the ERA5 data sets, if you're familiar with those, which are from a dynamical systems model of the climate system, but calibrated on observations of the weather. And so you get output from the model once it's calibrated without any gaps, because it's the output of a model. And it's the same with the Deb theory and all the things that can come out of there, even though you haven't put all those observations in the first place. So, for example, a good example is metabolic rate, often measured as oxygen consumption rate, but usually not used in the estimation procedure. Like, very few observations have this in the estimation procedure. But if we have the parameters estimated, we can produce the metabolic rate as an output. And so what you can see here in gray, the metabolic rate plot points from the database against mass. And then in orange, you can see data from a couple of different databases. So it's really powerful. And what we want ultimately, or what we can do, given that we have a dynamic energy budget model, of course, is link that to environmental conditions and predict trajectories of growth and reproduction and survival in nature under different climate scenarios and different management scenarios and so on. And that's what the niche mapper package is all about. So we're wanting to develop these databases, of course, so that we can have the parameters for these models, but as a side effect, in a way, from what we're trying to do here, we end up with these really tightly described and databases of traits. And we can then use this to ask questions about how species responses will vary depending on, in this case, two different scenarios of water availability for a lizard out in the desert. So, in summary, I hope to have illustrated the power of collecting trait data in the context of a dynamical systems model of an organism, be that metabolism or heat exchange or behavior. And to have made you aware of this enormous trait data resource in the form of the AMP project, to have shown how modern trait database approaches are ready and waiting for this trait data and for parameterization of these kinds of models, and also the notion of reanalysis functional trait data that you can get from these kind of approaches. And of course, having this target set of data tells us what the research community needs to prioritize in the future, collecting trait data. Thank you very much.